Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including two that have to do with very different economic outlooks coming up after this presidential election, and then our final article actually talking about the criticism that is coming from the people against the House and the Senate, aka Congress. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, when you look at the two presidential candidates, which one do you think is more pro business? Not just big business, not just small business. We want an overall blanket. Which one is more pro business? Throw your comments in the comment section. Love to hear what you have to say. And before you hear this first story, that's where I would comment everything because it may change your opinions or it may harden some of yours after you hear commentary about it. So our first article comes from Business Insider. Headline reads, Mark Cuban and other business titans are trying to woo conservative-leaning swing voters to support Kamala Harris. So for those who have not been paying attention to the culture Twitter wars / commentary going back and forth between all the conservative talking heads and Mr. Mark Cuban on the Twitter / X, but let's be clear, it's still Twitter in my mind, there have been rumblings that Kamala Harris will be just as good as any conservative or Republican could be on the economy. And this is not necessarily something that the Democrats within the last 12 to 16 years have been able to claim, at least with a solid track record. If you go back to the 80s, there's even more counterpoints to that argument. Then again, if you include the Bill Clinton era, which you have to, he was a Democratic president for 8 years. He was actually one of the only presidents to balance the budget for at least 1 year of his presidency. So there are counter arguments upon counter arguments in order to say one side is the only good side when it comes to monetary fiscal policy and ensuring that we are getting our spending on check, that everybody within the economy is benefiting, whether it be lower jobs and lower unemployment numbers in Democratic administrations and even during the Biden administration, even though you could say that for the average that what you would see for a Trump administration would be terribly affected by COVID. And you could say the same thing for Biden, actually, because he picked that up from the very first half. But all these different metrics don't necessarily tell you how the average person is feeling. And if you take a poll nowadays, the question of which party will better serve the economy or will better serve my pocketbook, it is definitely going to be a 55-45 issue, if not a 60-40 issue, where people are going to say the Republican Party is going to really look out for the interests of us, the people, and trying to make sure that our dollar is worth a lot. Now, you can make plenty of counter arguments about some of the policies that Mr. Trump, aka possible future president, can't forget that one, that he makes for this particular election cycle that may actually devalue or take away some of the purchasing power of American people. And you can make plenty of arguments about Kamala Harris's policies. Some of them are meant to actually help small businesses, some of the loans, but other ones may actually end up in more inflationary policy as we start to give more money and allow more money to flow into the economy coming from the government. Or you could even say that the repealing of the Trump tax cuts, which would be something that wouldn't just be her, it would have to be Congress and the Senate, but something that would definitely have to be allowed by her, then yeah, maybe you could see something that would actually strip people of a little bit of that extra wealth. Then again, it doesn't necessarily affect everybody below a certain threshold, so that's fair enough, but there would be less money flowing throughout the economy because people would be able to keep less of their money, even if it is the top 10%. So what is the actual argument that Mark Cuban and some of these other business owners are making to try to convince some of these conservatives? Because, like I said, it's a mixed bag. You can make arguments in one direction or another. And when we look at the statistics beforehand, if you want a better economy, you're probably going to vote conservative. Or at least if that is your number one issue, you're probably going to vote conservative. That's how the polls are leaning right now. Doesn't always mean that they will. Like I said, there's still that 40% that say the Democrats actually have better fiscal policies in mind. But what is Mark Cuban saying specifically because the headline doesn't just read trying to convince people to vote, it's trying to convince conservatives to come to Kamala Harris. Quote, the initiative is led by a group of business titans, including LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman, billionaire investor Mark Cuban, and Netflix co-founder Reed Hastings. It also included local business leaders from across the country, many of whom previously voted for former President Donald Trump. In a series of video testimonials, each business leader explains why they're supporting Kamala Harris over Trump, often referencing economic and business-related reasons rather than traditional Democratic priorities like abortion or social spending. So let's see what the people that are not just behind this effort, but also more leaning towards Kamala Harris, what some of their arguments are, and some of the statistics that they're using to back them up. Actually, we can just jump to the statistics. Quote, the Penn Wharton budget model has estimated that Trump's economic proposals would increase the national debt by 5.8 trillion over 10 years, while Harris's proposals would increase it by 1.2 trillion during the same time period. So you may be saying, well, why does that matter? Remember, the U.S. in less than a year ago, I believe less than a year and a half ago, had its credit rating downgraded. That means that the value or the stability of our bonds was basically brought down. And it was said, maybe you should be a little bit more tentative about whether or not they can pay it back. And there are multiple reasons for that. But one of them is our debt to GDP ratio is now over 1%. And about 1%. It's over 1. So if you're looking at it as 0.95, that would be 95%. And I believe it's somewhere around 120 right now, so 1.2 or 120% debt to GDP ratio currently, which is not actually good. What does that mean? That means that we have more debt than our economy is producing in a year, essentially. So even if you were to take all of the net products of the entire year. So let's say every single good sold within the United States, every final good, because you don't actually take the process, you don't take the ones that go into the final goods, you take the final goods. Then you say, okay, we're going to take all of that as the government and we're going to try to pay off our debts. You couldn't even pay off the debt for that year. So let's just do a quick Google search. National debt to GDP ratio. Let's just see. And yes, I am typing with one hand. That is why it's extremely slow. So if you go to fedstlouis.com, you can see here that it is roughly 120. The highest it has ever been in the year 2020 was about 132. Now, is that going to be the end of the world? Just because we have a high debt to GDP ratio means everything's going downhill? Not necessarily. But guess what? If you don't actually try to correct this, I believe England's sitting around 80% currently, but if you don't try to correct this, eventually your currency will just become worthless. People will not want to buy the U.S. bonds because they do not have faith in the U.S. government being able and or willing to pay off the debts that they owe to other places, meaning that the bonds are useless. They'll get downgraded to, because that's what a U.S. Treasury is. It's basically a bond that is backed by the U.S. government. Then the people will no longer buy them, meaning they will no longer actually, one, have faith in the U.S. dollar and faith in the U.S. government. But some of those funding projects that you are so needing, that you yearn for as a citizen, won't necessarily be able to be funded, because this is the way that we get a lot. Think about it this way. If you're a private company and you do not want to go to a bank to get a loan, we can, as the United States, we can go to other countries to get loans. We can go to banks to get loans, but normally they're in too large of amounts. So what we do is we sell bonds and we say, hey, we'll pay you back with interest later on. So this is how we actually self-fund some of these debt projects that we do, how we actually fund some of our spending. And we issue more treasuries. If we issue more treasury notes and we say, oh yeah, we're going to actually issue 100,000 this time instead of 90,000, and each one's worth $1, then that's 10,000 extra dollars that we're bringing in and we're going into debt. So we could stretch ourselves thin by continuing to do this, because as those bonds go down in reliability, people are wanting a higher premium on the bond. So if you buy something, let's say you buy a ice cream machine for $100, and you're going to pay off 10% of that every single month. So in 10 months, you'll have it paid off. But there is interest on that because you're doing installment plans on it. You're not just paying for it all up front. And the interest is 1% for each month that you're doing it. So essentially, you're going to pay an extra $10 because you're paying 1% for every month that you're paying it off. Well, if the person who is actually selling it to you doesn't believe that you're going to pay up, they believe that maybe you won't make your money back, maybe your business plan isn't good enough, maybe they don't have faith in your company, then they might say, oh, well, I'm not going to actually get my money back for the full machine because they may not make it that 10 months. They only may make it 5 more months. So I actually need a little bit higher interest. Maybe I'm going to charge you instead of 1% interest, I'm going to charge you 10% interest each month. So then you actually have to pay back a little bit more earlier. And this is what would happen if a U.S. Treasury is no longer trusted, basically a U.S. Treasury note, a bond. They're saying, okay, hey, if the United States is going to survive 10 years, then I can get my money back more than likely if they're not crazy in debt. So I'll take a normal 2%. If they think the U.S. dollar is going to fall, it's no longer going to be the United States reserve currency, the world reserve currency, maybe they'll say, I need a higher premium on this. I'm going to need 20% back in interest on the return, and I want it in 5 years instead because I don't necessarily know if you're going to make it to 10 years. So you understand when people are giving you their money, they want to see a return on it, and the riskier the investment, the higher the return they want to see because they could very well lose said money. I don't need to explain the basics of this to you. If you've taken any economics class, I take that back, not even any economics class. If you just have common sense, if you give $100 to a friend who is reliable and you know it's going to give it back to you, you're not going to charge any interest. If there's one friend who's a little bit sketchy, maybe you don't know him as much, and you give him $100, you say, for every month you don't pay me back, you're going to owe me another $10. That's an incentive for them to actually pay you back quicker. One, because you don't necessarily trust them, you don't necessarily have faith in them, so they want to get the debt off the books as quickly as possible so they don't have to keep paying more money. But also, it's a way to say, I also need a little bit more money for trusting you, essentially. So this is extremely, extremely important. When the U.S. dollar is not trusted, when the U.S. as an economic power is not believed in, the faith does not exist for it, then we start to see problems in our economic system, especially because we fund a lot of our spending off of debt in treasury notes. Because as you can see in the debt to GDP ratio, we can't, even if we taxed every single dollar that came through the United States, we still wouldn't be able to pay off our spending. Okay? Think about it that way. That's what the debt to GDP ratio means. That means that even if we had a completely communist system and every single dollar was taken from every single individual, every single company, then we still would not be able to actually pay for what we are trying to do. And that is a problem. So how does this relate to the Mark Cubans of the world? How does this relate to the people saying that we need to go for Miss Kamala Harris? You can see how there's a little bit of a synthesis of the argument there, which is if you actually care about limiting spending, if you actually care about trying to get the deficit under control so that there's more faith in the US dollar, that our debt to GDP ratio doesn't go up, then you could say that we're going to go with the person who says that they're going to increase, or at least the projections show from the Wharton School of Business, that they are going to increase the debt less. Now, is that actually how it will play out? Not necessarily. We know that Trump was a big spender during his time in office, just like Joe Biden was. So maybe there is an argument there where Trump will just blow out the spending again, just like Kamala Harris would. And we really have an argument of who is actually going to limit the amount that they're putting into the economy. But if you follow the track record of a Kamala Harris, Joe Biden presidency, we'll put it backwards, Joe Biden presidency, Vice President Kamala Harris vice presidency, then you see that, well, their spending is outrageous too. So what are the other factors that they want to go on? Because while I think their point is very, very true, that one will spend more than the other, they're both going to be spending outrageously, at least from what we've seen from the first administration of Donald Trump and a first semi-administration of Kamala Harris. Remember, she hopped on the ticket with Joe Biden, meaning she believed in his message. Does that mean that everything that he does, she endorses 100%? No, but you can't just throw it to the side and say, oh, well, no, disregard it. She did not come out and say, I don't agree with my president here. She backed her president. She's playing politics, I understand, but there are still ways that she could have come out and said, no, we need to do something different. So what are the other arguments besides just the fact that she is going to be more responsible on spending? Because that's what they're using, at least referencing here with the Wharton School of Business. Quote, when it comes to true business, doing business, she is completely open-minded, right? She doesn't have a preconceived notions. She is not an ideologue, Cuban said. She wants to know what I think, what everybody thinks, whether you're a small business, a large business, a public company, a 500,000 employee company, or you're an individual reseller on Etsy. She wants to know what's important to you, and she's willing to listen, end quote. And this is the argument that would be most persuasive to me, which is she is open-minded. She's willing to take advice. But also, this is the one that comes with the biggest asterisk for me as well, which is if she's open-minded and she has no preconceived notions of what should or should not be done, then she's also very influenceable. So maybe there are certain people like Elizabeth Warren who come in who say that we need to outrageously tax, even have a capital gains tax, which will actively discourage people from investing in the stock market and investing in companies and trying to create vehicles of creating economic growth for themselves and retirement plans, essentially, but also that we will limit the ability of companies to crowd fundraise, essentially, because people will be discouraged from putting their money away if they're going to be continuously taxed on it. So I understand where he's coming from, which is she's open-minded, she's willing to listen. She's also willing, she says she's willing to listen to everybody, but she's willing to listen to you specifically because you're giving money. Don't get it twisted. But also, that means that she doesn't necessarily have any hard lines saying, no, I won't do this, I won't do that, because she doesn't have any previous experience, and I'm not trying to belittle, at least she doesn't have some form of solid ideology, because that's a good thing. Don't get me wrong, it's a good thing and a bad thing. Not having a solid ideology means that you're not going to be blinded by that ideology, but that also means that you don't have underlying principles that you're going to adhere to, and I think that can very well be dangerous. And whether you like Trump or not, you know he has a certain ideology that he's going to stick to. Now, you may not like that ideology, fair enough. As I've outlined many times in this podcast and in past podcasts, I don't like some of the policies that are coming down. They worry me when I look at the way that he is handling some of the future spending. But that doesn't mean that he is inherently worse than Kamala Harris is. I'm not saying either one of them is worse on the economy. I think it's a fascinating conversation because we've seen what Donald Trump can do. We've seen him put more money into the pockets of people, but we've also seen him blow out the debt. And while conservatives love the fact that they're cutting taxes, they're trying to make sure that people have the ability to keep more of their money, there was also a whole bunch of extra spending under him and during Ronald Reagan's time. Don't forget that as well. And it is fascinating because those things they seem to be based on the previous conception of what a conservative/Republican was. They seem to be at odds and they seem to be at tension because both of those things live within the same party, and yet only one of them is being paid true homage to when these policies are being enacted by one of the candidates. Fascinating stuff. I've said fascinating enough times in this one where you could probably start a counter. You could have probably done a drinking game with how many times I have said fascinating. Now let's move into our second article that comes from Mises.org, and this one's a little bit more grim on the economy. This is a slow motion nationalization of the economy. So, for those of you who are sitting back and listening and saying, wow, that is some pretty crazy language coming from Mises.org. Remember, they are a more libertarian leaning kind of think tank / group. So, of course, anything that deprives the individual from being able to wield their money in a way that they see fit is going to be not necessarily nationalization, but akin to nationalization by taking the control away from the person and using the force of government in order to actually use that money how the government sees fit. So you can see that it's not necessarily going to be the most unbiased source in the world. They're coming in with their leanings from the very beginning. But like I said, we heard out what the Business Insider article had to say. Let's hear out what they have to say. Quote, since then, we have seen a chain of fresh stimulus policies. So this is talking about after the pandemic, basically. Quote, adding to the large fiscal packages already in place. Multi-trillion-dollar investment packages like the EU Next Generation Fund now include massive deficit spending plans. However, money velocity is not rising. All these programs only lead to secular stagnation. Government projects and current expenditures are consuming money at an unprecedented rate. So, what are they implying here? They're saying money velocity isn't changing. Well, what does money velocity actually mean? Well, I could give the layman's terms for it, but let's actually look it up so that you have a clinical, when I say clinical, it's not like we're doctors here, but a more textbook answer for it. Velocity of money. The velocity of money measures the number of times that one unit of currency is used to purchase goods and services within a given time period. The concept relates to the size of economic activity to a given money supply and the speed of money exchange in one of the variables that determines inflation. So, that's coming from Wikipedia, by the way. So, what does that mean in real terms? What does that actually get at for us? That means that this government spending is just shooting money into the economy that is not necessarily being passed around. But normally, it's not just talking about money being passed around from government to government, but rather, or government to people, it's talking about the money flowing between individuals. So if the government gives me $100, I love going back to $100 because it makes the math easy. And I spend $10 at $10 different locations, and those people use those $10 to buy 10 different products and blah, blah, blah. You can see that the velocity of money is high because the transactions caused by that money entering the economy are dispersing among people. But when it is just government spending and it's just paying for one thing or another, normally the velocity of money is not necessarily as high. Rather than allowing for the individual to determine where that is money going, to let it disperse throughout the free market, normally it is heavily targeted in one location or another. I am making this so simple, by the way. It is much more complicated than just saying, government spending bad, individual spending good. Because guess what? The government could give money to individuals in a way that is general and not necessarily targeted and increase the velocity of money, which is what happened during COVID. They printed out a whole bunch of extra money. People had extra money in their pockets and they were able to spend it, and the velocity of money increased. That is not happening in this case necessarily. So it's actually leading to stagnation rather than just straight up inflation. But like I said, it's a complicated topic. Go read on it a little bit more, and you can come back to be understanding the velocity of money. But what is Mises saying at overall? Quote, developed economists cannot live without new and larger spending plans. The result is more debt, weaker productivity growth, and declining real wages. Now, this is something that we very seldom talk about in the United States, but our productivity. We have not seen large productivity increases since, I believe, the early 90s. They've been slowly increasing since then. And that's how you can normally justify actually making more money, or you can justify giving people in your company more money. So say 10 years ago, the productivity across the United States was 50%. So 50% of the time that people spend, and this is not how the ratio is always determined, but think about it this way for simple terms, that you as an individual, for 50% of the time that you are at work, you're actually doing something productive. You are actually turning 8 hours into 4 hours of viable work that will help the company. And then in another, 5 years, the productivity is maybe 75%. So that's a 25% increase. And then as you get closer to this modern date, instead of it being a large 25% increase with all this new technology, it's starting to slowly wane. Okay. So you get to 75, then you get to maybe 80, then you get to 83, and then you get to 82, and then you get to 81. So you're seeing the rate at which productivity is growing, that meaning that the people can use those hours more efficiently, or at least more effectively, are starting to decline. This has happened in a lot of developed economies. It's not just the United States. And when this starts happening, you have less of a justification to give more money, because if you can say that because of that new computer that we gave John 10 years ago, he was able to do double the amount of work in the time that he was there at the computer. And you know what? That actually added not just double the amount of money to our balance sheet, it actually added triple, okay? Because he was doing so much extra work and it was actually exponential in the way that it helped the company. And then you could justify possibly giving them more money. If you see productivity stagnate, then there's less of a justification to give people more money because they're not actually adding more value to the company. And if prices continue to go up around them, then guess what? That's actually going to cause a crunch. You may have to fire some more people. Maybe you replace them with cheaper options that are just as productive. And as we've seen with computer programs nowadays, some jobs are not going to be as productive as a computer program could be with maybe 1 or 2 hours of tinkering, and you don't necessarily have to pay them as much. What? You pay an employee who's writing copy for you maybe $30 an hour, maybe not even that, even $21 an hour, and to pay for ChatGPT, you pay like $20 for it a month, essentially. I mean, when you do the math on that, it just doesn't make sense to keep that copy person around when the chat system can basically do the same thing at a lower cost when you spread it out over the course of the month. So with productivity not increasing and the velocity of money not necessarily increasing and debt increasing, you're starting to see people have less ability to purchase the same goods, and you're seeing a stagnation or decline in real wages, which is basically the wage based against its purchasing power or its ability to buy certain things in the economy. And this is going to continue to happen. I don't want to spend too much extra time on this one, though it is a very interesting article and we definitely could. I want to at least get to our last one within a normal time frame. So if you want to continue to hear about this exorbitant spending and how the government is slowly eating up more and more sectors as it's trying to stimulate them, go read this article. It's fascinating. It's not that much of a long read. I would say for me, I'm a slow reader, so it took me about 9 minutes. I think most people could probably get through it in 5. So go give it a read. And I feel like that first part of the conversation was interesting enough that if you really liked it, please go give them a read. Like I said, they are a little bit more libertarian leaning, but that doesn't mean that they're just whack jobs saying no government. They actually have solid ideas and they're trying to break it down in a way that makes sense to a lot of people. All right, so let's move to our last article. It'll be a quickie. It's coming from alternet.org. Shameful, Johnson slammed for saying Congress won't cut recess short to pass disaster relief. And when I read this, two parts of me were battling. One side was, okay, we're not spending extra money in order to relieve these people. The people who are deficit hawks are probably sitting there saying, I don't necessarily want to just cut off money for any project that's going to help people. It's not like it's necessarily wasteful spending, but at the same time, they're kind of happy that they're not actually spending excess amounts of money. And the other part of B was analyzing the people who are saying, no, it's the government's job to help its people, period, full stop. It's supposed to ensure the security and protection of its private property. And even if that doesn't necessarily happen from outside forces incurring on it, aka maybe a Canada invading, a Mexico invading, or Britain invading, anything like that, then it could still apply to natural disasters. And let's be clear, I got a little too philosophical there. The breakdown essentially is, should government spend money on this? There are some people who will always argue yes. There are some people, very few of them, who will always argue no. And those parts of me were at war because my question was, why not have your own, for the people that are outraged, why not give your own money where you can, give your own time where you can? And then I thought about it and I was saying to myself, with multiple millions of dollars in damages, it's not necessarily something that we can just crowdfund for. But my counter argument to that would be, if we want this to actually be something we care about as a society, we should donate our own money in order to help these people out. And you have to reverse the question a little bit and say, if I was in a situation like this, would I want other people to donate money to help my church in this community or help the random school that got hit really hard by the hurricane in North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, any of them? And those questions put the burden on the individual and the society rather than it being the government's job to do it. Now, I also think a lot of people are going to be more than willing in order to spend the money to actually take on the debt, the selling of those bonds, in order to help fund relief for these individuals. And not even individuals, entire communities that have been devastated by this. If there is any job of the government, like I had said earlier, any justifiable reason for its existence to protect the social compact, it is to ensure that we have a safe place in order to fully live out the rights that were bestowed upon us, that were outlined, don't say bestowed, were outlined for us at the creating and the founding of this nation, and providing relief and allowing these communities to not be completely disintegrated, destroyed, lives be lost. That can actually fall underneath that function. Now, do I think all the criticism is warranted? No, not necessarily. Do I think that if you fall into the camp where you believe that this is a proper use of government spending, then yeah, you should actually be calling for a recess to be not actually a special session. You should be calling for the special session saying the recess is over for a little bit. We need to get down there. Quote, however, Politico's Olivia Beavers reported via X early Sunday morning that Speaker Mike Johnson will not be calling the House back early to vote on disaster aid supplemental in the wake of the hurricane, end quote. And that's what's going to frustrate the people who believe this is the proper purview of government, which is to actually solve these situations, help out in these situations, protect the people. They would say, if it is within the bounds of what the government should do, then yeah, you need to get there right here and right now. I think that you may see a little bit of a counter argument, and most politicians wouldn't probably say it out loud, which is I do not believe it's the proper purview of the U.S. government in order to provide this aid under normal circumstances. I think that the community should donate. I think that every single person should donate. I think that people should go down there and actually give their time and their money. Small businesses, large businesses should donate time and money to actually go down there and help these sort of people out, and may not actually advocate, those people that believe that would not advocate for a government solution to this. I don't think they would say that out loud, though. I think that they would sit behind the politics of it, which is the recess is going on. But on a larger scale, I think that they lose this argument because you are looking at a large portion of different counties, segments of states essentially, that are literally drowning or were literally drowning in this hurricane, and the emotional resonance of that argument and those stories hit so hard that as a politician, even if you have that principled stance of we don't want the government to be the main fixer in this situation, the politics, the emotional, the pathos is going to win out there. So Mike Johnson's on a losing foot by not doing this politically. And also, if you agree with the sentiment that the government should step in here and is within their purview, then he should definitely be stepping up and saying, yeah, we will definitely come back from this recess early. It's a crisis. I mean, we literally have procedures in order to call out access funding for multiple different agencies, including FEMA. Why can't you make an exception for Congress in order to come back early from a recess in order to address this? I think it may actually be because he doesn't think it's the proper purview, but I don't know. It's speculation, just based on where he has been on certain issues previously and how he has viewed the budget previously. Then again, he became speaker and his mood had flipped a little bit. So we'll see how this fallout comes from there. And like I said, if you're a person that believes it is the purview of the government, keep pushing for that. If you think it's not the purview of the government, give your own money. Actually, I take that back. Either way, give your own money, give your own time. Even just say a prayer. Maybe you don't have more than a dime to give. Say a prayer for those people who have been affected. Because trust me, even if they can't hear your prayer, maybe the one above will actually hear it and help them out. And with that said, I know it's a sad topic, so we're going to try to be a little bit jolly here. We're going to jump to our daily delight. This one comes from Parade Pets. Headline reads, Cockatoo's tender friendship with Black Labrador sibling is giving people the feels. And watching these two interact, because there was a little bit of hesitation from the mama who brought them together. Like, I don't know if the dog's going to necessarily vibe with the cockatoo here, but just like some cats have copied dog tendencies in the past and acted more like a dog as they've gotten older, the cockatoo and the dog actually started to, mimic each other in very particular ways. And it's actually very funny hearing some of the quotes from the mother. And I believe there's a video attached to it on YouTube as well. So if you want to check out this article or any of today's articles, they'll all be linked in the description below. That like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. It's a little bit off the top of the head. Random thinking hasn't necessarily been fleshed out as much, isn't supported by articles to get us through the conversation. And then if you want to hear international news, that comes out on the same day, Tuesday and Thursday, but it's at the same RSS feed and the same YouTube channel as this podcast that comes out on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So if you want to check any of that out, come on back. We'd love to have you. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.